A man cut down on the battlefield, his throat pierced by an arrow, his empire crumbling with his final breath. Harald Hardrada, the last Viking king, died as he lived in the fury of battle. His fall at Stamford Bridge in 1066 marked more than the death of a king. It marked the end of the Viking Age itself. But who was Harald, and how did an exiled boy from Norway rise to stand at the edge of destiny? Welcome to various eras in time. Now, let's begin our journey. This is not just the story of a king, it is the story of loyalty and betrayal, ambition and downfall, triumph and tragedy. From the icy fjords of Norway to the golden palaces of Byzantium, from a nameless exile to a feared monarch, Harald's journey reads like a saga carved in blood and fire. What if Harald had triumphed at Stamford Bridge? What if the last Viking king had gone on to claim the throne of England? Would the Norman conquest have happened? Would Europe itself look different today? On September 25th, 1066, the world of the Vikings came crashing down on the fields of Stamford Bridge. The morning mist clung to the English countryside, as if the land itself held its breath for what was about to unfold. On one side stood King Harald Hardrada of Norway, a towering figure who had carved his legend across continents. On the other stood Harold Godwinson, the newly crowned King of England, his forces hardened and furious after racing north to defend their homeland. This was no ordinary battle, it was the climax of centuries of Viking raids, conquests and ambitions, and at its center stood a man who embodied the Viking spirit more than any who had come before him, Harald Hardrada, the last Viking king. The clash at Stamford Bridge was unlike anything England had ever seen. Harald had arrived with a vast fleet, his banners flying proudly, his warriors seasoned from decades of war. He believed he would seize the English throne as his ancestors had taken kingdoms before him, yet fate had other plans. Godwinson's army struck swiftly, catching the Vikings unprepared. What followed was a slaughter, a chaos of steel and blood. In the heat of battle, Harald fought with the fury of a man who refused to yield. Tall, broad, his presence was said to command both awe and terror, but his valor alone could not turn the tide. An arrow struck him down, piercing his throat, ending not only his life but also the age of the Viking kings. The image of Harald's fall is seared into the tapestry of history, a warrior king meeting his end far from home, betrayed not by men but by the weight of destiny. With his death, the Viking dream of empire crumbled. The raiders who once terrorized Europe, the explorers who reached as far as Vinland, the warriors who bent kingdoms to their will, their time was over. Harald's defeat marked the twilight of an age, a final echo of Norse power before the Norman conquest reshaped England forever. But to understand why Harald's death was so significant, we must ask, who was this man? How did an exiled boy, stripped of everything, rise to become the most feared king of his age? And perhaps most intriguingly, what if Harald Hardrada had won at Stamford Bridge? The course of English, even world history, might have been rewritten. The Normans under William of Normandy may never have conquered. The Viking Age may have endured, altering the balance of power across medieval Europe. This is the story of Harald Hardrada, a tale of loyalty and betrayal, ambition and downfall, triumph and tragedy. From the frozen fjords of Norway to the glittering palaces of Byzantium, from mercenary to monarch, his life reads like an epic saga written in blood and fire. He was the last Viking king, and his story is one of the most extraordinary journeys in all of history. Before he was called Hardrada, the Stern, Harald was just a boy born into a world of uncertainty. He entered life in 1015 in Ringerike, Norway, during one of the most turbulent chapters in Viking history. The Viking Age had already stretched across centuries, filling Europe with both awe and terror, yet the balance of power in Scandinavia was fragile. His half-brother, Olaf Haraldsson, later known as Saint Olaf, ruled Norway with fire and faith, trying to unite the land under both the Christian cross and the iron fist of royal authority. It was a dangerous time to be a child of royal blood, for every ally could become a rival, and every oath of loyalty could mask betrayal. Harald grew up idolizing Olaf, a brother who embodied both courage and conviction. Yet loyalty to Olaf came with a price. Many of Norway's powerful chieftains despised Olaf's centralization of power and his embrace of Christianity. For them, the old gods and the old freedoms of the Viking jarls were not to be abandoned lightly. In the year 1030, when Harald was only 15, the storm finally broke. At the Battle of Stiklestad, Olaf's forces faced a coalition of rebellious nobles and Danish allies determined to topple him. Young Harald fought by his brother's side, already showing a fearlessness beyond his years. But fate can be cruel. Olaf fell in battle, struck down in the chaos. The rebellion triumphed and Harald's world was shattered. For Harald, that moment was more than just the death of a brother. It was the death of innocence, of stability, of any chance at a simple life. The boy who had believed in Olaf's dream of a unified Norway suddenly found himself a fugitive, hunted by the same nobles who had once sworn allegiance to his family. Betrayal was no longer a distant threat. It had stolen his brother and forced Harald to flee. With nothing but a small band of loyal followers, he slipped away from Norway, his future as uncertain as the horizon itself. And yet, even in exile, the seeds of greatness were already taking root. Stripped of land, title, and safety, Harald could have vanished into obscurity, remembered only as the brother of a fallen king. But instead he embraced the very essence of the Viking spirit, resilience in the face of disaster. He chose not to remain a victim of betrayal, but to forge a destiny of his own. From the ashes of defeat, Harald began the long journey that would transform him from an exiled boy into a warrior whose name would echo across continents. But exile was not a road walked alone. The loyalty of a few men who refused to abandon him became the foundation of his survival. Their devotion, tested in hunger and hardship, bound them together in a way no crown or title could. For Harald, loyalty was no longer an abstract virtue. It was the difference between life and death. Still, the question lingered like a shadow. What if Olaf had triumphed, and Harald had grown up in a Norway united under his brother's rule? Would he have become the legendary king remembered today, or would he have been nothing more than a noble in his brother's shadow? Fate had chosen otherwise, and in that choice, Harald's saga was set into motion. Exile did not break Harald. It forged him. Cast out of Norway after his brother Olaf's defeat at Stiklestad, Harald carried with him more than grief. He carried a vision, one that his fallen brother had planted deep in his soul. The dream of a unified Norway free from foreign influence and noble betrayals. Though Olaf's body lay in the soil of Stiklestad, his spirit lived on in Harald's determination. It was loyalty to that vision, more than to a crown or title, that drove Harald onward through the darkest years of his youth. But dreams alone cannot keep a man alive in exile. Harald, still just a teenager, found himself with only a small band of warriors who refused to abandon him. They were men bound not by riches, but by loyalty. Together they wandered, hunted, and fought to survive. Each hardship sharpened Harald's edge. Every betrayal they escaped, every storm they endured, carved away his youth and left behind something harder, something unyielding. By the time he left Norway's shores, the boy who had followed his brother into battle had begun the transformation into the warrior who would one day shake empires. It is said that Harald looked ever eastward, seeking opportunity beyond the familiar fjords. In those years, Scandinavia was not the center of power. It was Byzantium, the glittering empire whose walls enclosed both unimaginable wealth and ceaseless intrigue. Many Norse exiles turned their gaze there, to the fabled Varangian Guard, the emperor's elite corps of foreign warriors. To serve in Byzantium was to gain wealth, honor, and skill, and perhaps, as Harald believed, the means to one day reclaim a throne. And so Harald's loyalty to Olaf's vision carried him across seas and rivers, through Slavic lands, until at last he reached the imperial heart of Constantinople. There, beneath golden domes and mosaics, he would become more than a wandering exile. He would become a weapon honed in the service of emperors. Yet even as he entered that world of splendor and danger, betrayal betrayal remained close at hand. Byzantium was a city where loyalty was a currency easily spent and often discarded. For Harald, whose very survival had depended on trust and brotherhood, the empire's shifting loyalties would test his resolve. What if Harald had abandoned Olaf's vision, content to live and die a mercenary in Byzantium, surrounded by riches but forgotten by history? The Viking Age might have ended without a king named Hardrada, and Stamford Bridge may have remained just another quiet meadow in England, but Harald was no ordinary exile. His loyalty to his brother's dream burned like a torch, guiding him through the darkness, and in the crucible of Byzantium, that torch would ignite into a flame that neither betrayal nor death could easily extinguish. The boy who fled Norway was about to become the warrior who would one day return to claim it. Harald's exile was not an ending, it was a beginning. Cast out of Norway at 15, he refused to wither in obscurity. Instead, he gathered what remained of his loyal companions and turned his gaze east, toward the lands of promise and peril. The sagas tell us that Harald journeyed through Sweden, down the rivers of the Rus, and into the bustling trade routes that linked Scandinavia with the riches of Constantinople. This was not a simple voyage. Every step carried danger, hostile tribes, treacherous waters, and the ever-present risk of betrayal. Yet Harald pressed on, his eyes fixed on a destiny larger than survival. In these travels, Harald learned not only how to fight, but how to lead. His band of warriors, bound by loyalty and hunger for fortune, depended on him for survival. Food was scarce, enemies many, but Harald's resolve never faltered. The boy who had once followed his brother Olaf now commanded men of his own, earning their loyalty not through a crown but through sheer strength of character and unshakable will. Each river crossed, each village faced, hardened Harald into the figure history would later remember. Tall, commanding, and utterly relentless. At last, he reached Constantinople, the city the Norse called Miklagard, the great city. To Harald and his men, it must have seemed like another world, towering walls stretching as far as the eye could see, markets overflowing with silks and spices, and domes of gold glinting in the Mediterranean sun. Here stood the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire, a place of wealth beyond imagining, but also of endless intrigue and treachery. For Harald, it was the perfect crucible. He entered the service of the Varangian Guard, the emperor's elite force of foreign warriors. To serve here was to stand at the crossroads of power. These guards were famed for their loyalty, a loyalty bought with gold and secured by honor. Among them, Harald rose quickly, his presence unmistakable, his courage undeniable. He fought in campaigns across the empire, in Sicily, in the Mediterranean, against pirates, rebels, and enemies who tested the empire's might. Each battle carved his name deeper into the annals of both Viking and Byzantine memory. But Byzantium was a city built on ambition and betrayal. Emperors rose and fell through palace plots, and loyalty was often just another mask for self-interest. Harald, who had once lost his brother to betrayal, now navigated a world where trust was as fragile as glass. Yet unlike many, he thrived. He amassed wealth, experience, and a reputation that reached beyond the empire's walls. In time, his exploits became the stuff of legend. A Viking prince commanding Byzantine armies, feared and admired in equal measure. What if Harald had never made it to Byzantium? His name might never have been spoken outside Norway. History might have remembered only Olaf as the last royal dreamer of their family. But Harald did survive, and with each victory, he built not only fortune, but the foundation of a destiny that would one day lead him back to Norway, no longer as an exiled boy, but as a hardened warrior with a king's ambition. To the Byzantines, Harald was no ordinary recruit. Tall, imposing, with eyes said to burn with the cold fire of the north, he quickly stood out among the Varangian Guard. This was no small honor. The Guard were not common soldiers. They were the Emperor's most trusted warriors, renowned for their unshakable loyalty and terrifying skill in battle. To the Norse, Byzantium was a land of gold. To the Byzantines, Harald and his men were living weapons. Harold's years of service read like the pages of an epic. He fought in Sicily against Arab forces, led campaigns across the Mediterranean, and even journeyed to Jerusalem to protect Christian pilgrims. In every campaign, Harold proved himself fearless. He gained not only spoils of war but also immense prestige. By the time he reached his 20s, he was not just a wandering exile, he was a commander whose name carried weight in the empire's corridors of power. But power in Byzantium was a dangerous gift. The city was a maze of plots and rivalries, where emperors could be overthrown overnight and loyalty was tested at every turn. The Varangian Guard was sworn to protect the emperor, but emperors themselves came and went, often betrayed by their own kin or courtiers. Harold's loyalty was constantly pulled in conflicting directions. He fought under emperors who trusted him, but he also witnessed how quickly alliances could crumble. To survive in Byzantium was to walk a tightrope between loyalty and betrayal. The sagas suggest that Harold himself may have been caught in these webs of intrigue. One account tells us he was imprisoned after falling out of favor in the court. Whether this was due to political rivalry, suspicion of his ambition, or a lover's betrayal remains uncertain. But even in chains, Harold's legend grew. Some say he escaped with the help of allies within the guard. Others claim he carved his way out. Whatever the truth, the lesson was clear. In Byzantium, betrayal was inevitable, but survival belonged to those who adapted. Yet Harold did not leave empty-handed. He carried with him not only immense wealth, treasures of gold, silver and jewels, but also a wealth of experience. He had seen the vastness of empires, commanded armies larger than any in Scandinavia, and learned the art of ruling through both steel and strategy. Byzantium had not broken him, it had sharpened him. What if Harold had chosen to remain in Byzantium, content with power, riches, and a place among the emperor's most trusted? He might have died as a general in a foreign land, remembered only in Byzantine chronicles. The course of Norway's history might have taken another path, with no Hardrada to claim its throne. But Harold's heart was never meant to belong to Byzantium. His eyes were always fixed northward, to the land he had lost, to the dream of a crown denied to him in youth. Byzantium gave him the tools, but Norway remained his destiny. The exile had become a conqueror, and now he was ready to return home, not as a boy running from betrayal, but as a man prepared to seize what fate had once stolen. When Harold finally departed Byzantium, he was no longer the boy who had fled Norway in the shadow of defeat. He was a man of iron, a battle-scarred warrior who had fought in the service of emperors, sailed across seas, and commanded armies far greater than any Viking force of old. The wealth he carried was immense: gold, silver, silks and jewels, the spoils of years of war and loyalty. But greater than wealth was his reputation. In distant lands, men spoke of the towering Norseman who led the Emperor's Guard, a commander who had carved victory after victory. Harold was no longer just an exile. He was Hardrada, the Stern, a name that would echo across the north. His journey homeward was not a retreat, but a return with purpose. Every coin in his treasure, every scar on his body was fuel for the fire that had burned since Stiklestad. He had left Norway as the defeated brother of Olaf, the boy who had escaped death by inches. Now he came back as a man determined to avenge that defeat and claim the throne that betrayal and fate had once denied him. But Harold knew that power was never gained by gold alone. Wealth could buy ships, and warriors could be lured by silver. But loyalty required something deeper. Harold's years in Byzantium had taught him the fragility of loyalty in a world of politics and betrayal. He understood that to unite men under his banner, he needed not only riches but also a vision, the same vision his brother Olaf had carried, a dream of a Norway united under one king. In this, Harold was cunning. He did not present himself as a returning exile desperate for power. Instead, he presented himself as a seasoned warrior, a man chosen by fate, whose victories abroad had proven his right to rule at home. To the chieftains and jarls of Norway, Harold was more than a claimant. He was a living embodiment of the Viking spirit, bold, unyielding, relentless. His legend was already larger than life, and in the sagas of the north that mattered as much as any blade or crown. The sagas hint that Harald's return was not without resistance. Power in Norway was contested, alliances fragile. His claim to kingship rested not only on bloodline but on force, and force was something Harald never lacked. Battles were fought, oaths were made, and betrayals lurked in the shadows. Yet Harald pressed forward with the same resolve that had carried him through exile, through Byzantium, and through every storm that sought to break him. What if Harald had chosen differently? History might have remembered him as a footnote in Byzantine chronicles, another warrior lost in the shadows of empire. Norway might never have felt his rule, and the last great chapter of the Viking Age might never have been written. But Harald did not choose obscurity, he chose destiny. With sword and silver, with loyalty and fire, he carved his path back to Norway. And as the exile returned as a conqueror, the legend of Harald Hardrada began to eclipse the memory of Olaf, his fallen brother. The boy who once fled in defeat had risen as a man determined to wear the crown, a king not of peace, but of power. The last Viking king was taking shape. Harald Hardrada returned to Norway not as a fugitive, but as a man transformed. A warrior hardened by years in exile, a commander polished by service in Byzantium, and a leader who carried both wealth and legend in equal measure. Yet claiming the throne of Norway was no simple matter. Power in Scandinavia was always contested, and Norway itself was fractured between rival claimants. Harald's own nephew, Magnus the Good, son of Olaf, already sat upon the throne. To many, Magnus represented continuity with Olaf's legacy, a king who brought stability after years of turmoil. For Harald, however, Magnus was both family and obstacle. The question of loyalty now loomed. Should Harald bend the knee to his nephew, accepting a subordinate role in the kingdom he had fought to reclaim? Or should he challenge Magnus outright, risking the blood of kin in pursuit of his destiny? In the end, pragmatism prevailed. Harald struck an agreement with Magnus. They would share the rule of Norway. It was an uneasy alliance built on blood ties but laced with tension. To the people, it appeared a compromise born of loyalty to their shared lineage. To Harald, it was a stepping stone, for he knew that power shared was power weakened, and his ambition would not allow him to remain in the shadows of another. Magnus was young and untested, while Harald carried the scars and wisdom of countless campaigns. Their rule together was brief, and fate soon intervened. In 1047, Magnus died unexpectedly, leaving Harald as the sole ruler of Norway. Whether his death was natural or encouraged by the hands of men will forever remain uncertain. What is clear is that Harald stepped into the throne he had long dreamed of, finally crowned as king. The exile had returned. The boy cast into darkness at Stiklestad had risen to sit upon the very throne his brother once held. But kingship brought not only triumph, but challenges. Harald ruled with a firm and often ruthless hand. He centralized power, strengthened royal authority, and suppressed the influence of rebellious nobles who sought to undermine him. Loyalty to Harald was rewarded richly, but betrayal was met with unflinching punishment. His rule earned him the epithet Hardrada, the stern, a reflection of his uncompromising nature. To some, he was a tyrant. To others, a strong king who brought order to a divided land. Still, Harald's ambitions stretched beyond Norway's mountains and fjords. He was not content to merely rule one kingdom. He hungered for more, for glory, for conquest, for the same kind of empire building that had defined the greatest Viking leaders before him. Norway was his foundation, but his gaze stretched across the sea to Denmark, to England, to the wider world. What if Harald had been content with Norway alone? Perhaps his reign would have been long and stable, his name remembered as a domestic king rather than a legendary conqueror. Yet Harald was never content with half measures. His life had been built on ambition, fueled by loyalty to his brother's dream and sharpened by years of betrayal. To sit still was to fade, and Harald was determined never to fade. With the crown secure upon his head, Harald Hardrada was no longer an exile, no longer a mercenary. no longer merely the nephew of Magnus or the brother of Olaf. He was king, a king with a destiny yet unfinished, a king whose saga was only just beginning. With the crown finally secured, Harald Hardrada ruled Norway with the stern resolve that earned him his epithet, Hardrada, the Stern. His reign was marked by strength, authority, and an unyielding grip on power. Harald was not a king who compromised easily. To his supporters, he was a protector of order, a ruler who curbed the chaos of feuding jarls and lawless chieftains. To his enemies, he was harsh and unforgiving, a man who demanded loyalty with rewards of silver and crushed rebellion with merciless force. Loyalty was the lifeblood of Harald's kingship, and betrayal was a crime that seldom went unpunished. But Harald was never content with Norway alone. His ambition, forged in exile and sharpened in Byzantium, extended beyond the fjords and mountains. His gaze turned southward to Denmark, a kingdom that had once held sway over Norway. For Harald, the conquest of Denmark was not merely a territorial ambition. It was a matter of pride and vengeance, a chance to reverse the humiliation his family had suffered when Denmark had supported the nobles against Olaf at Stiklestad. Year after year, Harald launched campaigns against Denmark. His fleets sailed across the Skagerrak, clashing with the forces of King Svein II. These wars were brutal, costly, and often indecisive. Harald burned villages, seized wealth, and terrorized coasts. But Denmark proved stubborn. Victory eluded him, not because he lacked strength, but because fortune and politics often shifted against him. Still, Harald pressed on, his determination unbroken. To retreat was not in his nature. Each campaign reinforced his reputation as a relentless king, one whose ambition refused to be satisfied. At home, Harald's reign was equally demanding. He imposed strict control over the jarls, reducing their independence and strengthening royal authority. This centralization of power made him both admired and despised. The common people often viewed him as a strong ruler who brought stability, while the noble class bristled under his iron hand. Harald's justice was swift and often brutal. Yet in a land fractured by rivalries and past betrayals, perhaps only such stern rule could hold Norway together. Harald also sought to project his power through alliances. His marriage to Elisiv of Kiev connected him to the powerful rulers of Rus, reinforcing his ties to the lands he had once passed through in exile. These bonds not only strengthened his legitimacy, but also underscored the breadth of his ambition. Harald was not merely a king of Norway, he was a player in the grand chessboard of Northern Europe, a figure whose influence stretched far beyond his borders. And yet, despite his wealth, his armies, and his authority, Harald remained restless. Triumph in Norway was not enough, and his Danish campaigns brought frustration as often as victory. The hunger that had driven him since exile still gnawed at him. To Harald there was always more to be won, always another crown to claim. What if Harald had turned inward, content to strengthen Norway and let his ambition rest? Could his reign have brought decades of peace, stability, and prosperity to his people? For Harald, peace was not destiny. His path was carved in steel and blood, and his ambition pointed him ever outward. The throne of Norway was his, but his eyes had already turned toward another, the throne of England. Harald Hardrada ruled Norway with an iron hand, while strong, can also be brittle. Beneath the surface of his stern authority, cracks began to form. Cracks born of resentment, ambition, and betrayal. The jarls and nobles of Norway had long been accustomed to independence, to ruling their lands with little interference from the crown. Harald's efforts to centralize power, to strip them of autonomy and bend them to his will, bred quiet rebellion in their hearts. Loyalty could be commanded on the battlefield, but in the cold halls of politics, loyalty often wavered. Harald understood this better than most. He had spent years in Byzantium, where betrayal was as common as bread, where emperors rose and fell on the daggers of their own guards. But Norway was not Byzantium. Here, loyalty was shaped not by gold or intrigue alone, but by kinship, tradition, and pride. When Harald demanded obedience, many nobles bristled, and some began to look for ways to undermine him. The very people he sought to unite were the same ones who tested his authority again and again. One of Harald's greatest challenges came not from distant Denmark, but from within his own realm. Certain families, whose power had been curtailed by his stern rule, began to whisper of alternatives. Some looked across the sea to Denmark, wondering if an alliance with King Svein might loosen Harald's grip. Others muttered about Harald's heavy taxes, resenting how his endless wars drained their wealth. The embers of betrayal glowed, waiting only for the right wind to ignite. And yet, Harald was not blind. He struck swiftly at signs of disloyalty, crushing rebellions before they could bloom. He rewarded those who stood by him, weaving a network of loyal supporters who owed their fortunes to his rule. Still, loyalty bought with rewards was fragile, and Harald knew it. Betrayal, once it poisoned the well, spread quickly. Even within Harald's family, tensions stirred. His marriage to Elisiv of Kiev had strengthened his ties abroad, but closer to home, rivalries between kin threatened unity. Ambition was not a flame unique to Harald, it burned in others as well, and in the competitive world of Viking nobility, betrayal often came not from strangers, but from those closest by blood. For Harald, every betrayal, real or suspected, hardened his resolve. He ruled as Hardrada, the stern, because he believed mercy was weakness and compromise was an invitation to revolt. To his supporters, this strength was the reason Norway remained intact. To his enemies, it was tyranny. Betrayal bred ruthlessness, and ruthlessness bred more betrayal. It was a cycle Harald could never fully escape. Could loyalty have been nurtured through trust rather than fear, or would leniency have shattered his fragile hold on power, leaving Norway once more divided among warring nobles? Harald made his choice, and his choice was steel. But while betrayals simmered at home, Harald's gaze was fixed outward. England was in turmoil, and its throne was ripe for the taking. For Harald, the divisions at home only reinforced his need for a greater conquest abroad. One final gamble that could silence his enemies and secure his name as not only King of Norway, but ruler of England. By the mid-1060s, Harald Hardrada's gaze fixed firmly on England. The throne of that troubled kingdom was more than just a prize. It was a legacy he believed was his by right. Years earlier, an agreement had supposedly been made between King Harthacnut of Denmark and Magnus the Good of Norway. If one died without an heir, the other would inherit the thrones of both kingdoms. When Magnus died, Harald claimed that this agreement extended to him as Magnus's successor. By Harald's reckoning, the English crown was not simply a dream, but his rightful inheritance. Yet England was not without contenders. Harold Godwinson, the powerful Earl of Wessex, seized the crown after the death of Edward the Confessor. To Harold, this was betrayal, not just of law, but of loyalty between kings. To the English nobles, Harold was their chosen leader. To Harald Hardrada, he was an usurper standing between him and destiny. Harald began to gather his forces. Across Norway, men were called to arms. Fleets of longships were prepared and alliances forged. One of the most significant came from Tostig Godwinson, Harold's own brother, who had been exiled and now sought revenge. Betrayal had once again opened a path for Harold. With Tostig's support, he could strike England not as a foreign invader alone, but as a champion of a disgraced English noble. In 1066, Harold launched his invasion. His fleet, said to number over 300 ships, carried thousands of warriors across the North Sea. The scale of the expedition was immense, a testament to Harold's ambition and his ability to command loyalty even in the face of risk. To his men, this was not merely a campaign, it was the chance to follow their king to eternal glory. To Harold, it was the culmination of everything his life had been building toward. Exile avenged, betrayal repaid, and destiny fulfilled. But England was no easy prize. The political landscape was fractured, loyalties divided, and betrayal hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Harald believed that victory would come quickly, that his reputation and force would bend the English to his will. What if the English nobles had abandoned him and bent the knee to Harald? The history of England, even of Europe, might have been rewritten. For in the same year, across the Channel, William of Normandy was also preparing his invasion. Had Harald succeeded, the Norman conquest might never have happened, and the legacy of England might have been carved with a Norse blade instead of a Norman one. With banners raised and swords sharpened, Harald Hardrada sailed to England to his final triumph. On September 25th, 1066, Harald Hardrada faced his destiny on the fields near Stamford Bridge. Days earlier, he had crushed English resistance at Fulford alongside Tostig, seizing York and believing the north was his. Confidence swelled through the Viking ranks. Harald believed the English crown was within his grasp, yet triumph can quickly become a trap. Harold Godwinson, the English king, marched his army north with astonishing speed, covering miles in days to confront the invaders. The Vikings were caught off guard. Many had left their armor behind in the unseasonal warmth, expecting negotiations, not battle. When the English forces appeared, it was as if the very earth had betrayed them. Still, Harold did not waver. He rallied his men, his towering presence a beacon amid the chaos. Swords clashed, shields splintered, and the quiet fields erupted into a storm of steel. The sagas tell of Harold's unmatched ferocity that day. He fought with both hands, his great frame cutting through English lines, his voice carrying above the din of war. To his warriors it seemed no arrow could fell him, no blade could pierce his will, but destiny is relentless. In the heat of battle, an arrow struck his throat, silencing the man whose roar had once echoed in Byzantium, in Norway, and now in England. Harold fell, and with him came the Viking dream of empire. The surviving Norsemen fled in desperation, retreating with barely enough ships to carry them home. From over 300 vessels that had set sail, barely 24 returned. The age of Viking conquest, the age that had begun with raids centuries earlier, ended on that battlefield. What if Harold had worn his armor? Could Harold have triumphed, claimed England, and forever altered the path of history? Harald Hardrada's death at Stamford Bridge was more than the fall of a king. It was the twilight of an age that had reshaped Europe. For nearly 3 centuries, Vikings had raided, traded and ruled, their longships carving paths from Vinland to Byzantium. Harold embodied the last breath of that spirit, ambitious, relentless, larger than life. With his death, the Viking Age closed, and a new chapter of European history began. Just weeks later, Harold Godwinson himself would fall to William of Normandy at the Battle of Hastings. England, battered by 2 invasions in a single year, succumbed not to the Vikings, but to the Normans. Had Harold lived, the story might have been different. England might have become part of a Norse empire, its culture shaped by the north rather than the continent. Perhaps the language of England would have carried more Norse echoes, its monarchy tied not to Normandy, but to Norway. Yet Harold's legacy is not measured only in what might have been. He was the last of the great Viking kings, a figure who carried the old warrior ethos into a new age of kingdoms and empires. His life was a saga of loyalty and betrayal, triumph and tragedy, ambition and downfall. From a boy exiled after Stiklestad to a king who shook the thrones of Europe, Harald Hardrada lived a life that few could equal. History remembers him as stern, unyielding, relentless. But perhaps it is better to remember him as the embodiment of a world that refused to go quietly. Harold's arrow-struck fall at Stamford Bridge was not just the death of a man, but the death of an age, the end of the Viking dream, and the dawn of a new Europe. And so ends the saga of Harald Hardrada, the last Viking king. From exile to emperor's guard, from mercenary to monarch, his life was a storm that swept across Europe. He was loyal and betrayed, triumphant and broken, fierce and unyielding. His fall at Stamford Bridge in 1066 was not just the death of a king, but the death of an age. With Harold's last breath, The Viking dream of conquest faded into legend. But history is never without its haunting questions. What if Harald had triumphed? What if the arrow had missed and the English throne had been his? England's destiny, and perhaps all of Europe's, might have been rewritten. The Norman conquest may never have come. The languages we speak, the borders we know, the history we take for granted, all could have been different. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found Harald's story as compelling as we did, don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more of our videos. See you in the next video.